Long before the sun refused to set over its territories, long before the color red claimed entire continents on the maps of the world, there existed only one island, an island of recent memory, still stained by the iron and blood of its own internal wars. The 16th century was stretching over an England that still licked its wounds, a nation of silent fields and moss-covered castles, whose horizon drowned in the same grey waters that kept it imprisoned. The outside world was a vast and dangerous rumour, a story that arrived on the ships of Genoese merchants, or in the constant fear of an invasion from France or Spain. The word empire was not a project, nor even a whispered dream. It was a dead word, an echo of ancient Rome relegated to history books, not a destiny inscribed in the stars. The Tudor dynasty, born on the battlefield of Bosworth, was above all a lineage of survivors. Its founder, Henry, the seventh of his name, was a king of winter. His concern was not the conquest of distant worlds, but the survival of his own throne, a fragile and perpetually contested throne. He counted his gold with the zeal of a miser, not out of simple greed, but out of a deep fear. Each coin was a soldier, a wall against the ghosts of civil war. His gaze was fixed on English soil, on the faces of his barons, on the genealogies of his rivals. The sea was not a path to glory. It was a moat, a liquid wall that protected him from his fears. Then came his son, Henry VIII, a man of appetites as colossal as the kingdom he inherited. But his ambition at first also looked inward, toward the continent. He yearned for the glory of French battlefields, the prestige of great European monarchs. And when his gaze turned bolder, it was not toward a new world, but against an ancient one, that of the Church of Rome. In breaking with the Pope, Henry was not seeking an empire. He was seeking a new wife and unquestionable supremacy. However, in his fury and pride, he unknowingly forged one of the key tools of the future. Isolated and fearful of a Catholic crusade, he invested the plundered wealth of monasteries in timber and cannons. In the shipyards of Deptford and Woolwich, the echo of hammers on English oak was not only building ships, it was unknowingly heralding the birth of a naval power, the Royal Navy. These were vessels designed for defense, to patrol the Channel, but in their robust construction lay the promise of much longer journeys. It was under the reign of his daughter, Elizabeth, that the wind began to blow in a new direction. A queen caught between the memory of instability and the prophecy of an uncertain destiny. Protestant in a Catholic world that harassed her, she understood that the survival of her kingdom depended on something more than stone walls. It depended on those wooden ships and the men who crewed them. Men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, whom official history calls explorers, but who in their time were a hybrid and dangerous creature, part patriot, part pirate. They were not the generals of an imperial army. They were the sea wolves of a beleaguered queen, funded in part by the crown and in part by London merchants. They set sail in small vessels, reeking of salt, tar, and gunpowder, with the mission of nipping at the heels of the Spanish colossus. Their voyages were not aimed at planting flags, but at plundering galleons. They brought back silver, gold, spices, and, most importantly, knowledge. Tales of distant shores, of unknown winds, of the immense wealth and surprising vulnerability of the Spanish Empire. Each successful raid was a needle stuck in the side of Philip II, and a spark that ignited the English imagination. The sea, very slowly, was ceasing to be merely a barrier. There were attempts, clumsy and premature, to set foot in that new world. Walter Raleigh, the poet and courtier, dreamed of a Virginia in honor of his virgin queen. On the island of Roanoke, a handful of men, women, and children tried to carve out a life in a land they did not understand. But the dream drowned in the silence of an indifferent continent. When the supply ships returned, they found not the roar of a battle, nor the ashes of a fire. They only found an unsettling absence and a word carved on a post: Croatoan. There was no chronicle, only a void, a whisper in the Atlantic wind warning that empires do not arise from a single decree, but must be earned with sweat, blood, and often with the bitter taste of failure. By the end of the century, with the great Spanish Armada broken and scattered by storms and English cannons, something had changed in the soul of the island. Fear had given way to a precarious but growing confidence. England's gaze, for so long fixed on its own soil or on its European neighbours, was beginning to lift, to cross the ocean with a new and bold curiosity. The Tudors were coming to an end. The Queen was aging without an heir. But the ships were ready in the ports. The navigation charts were being drawn with more daring, and in the taverns of Plymouth and Bristol, sailors told stories that were no longer just of piracy, but of possibility. The seeds of empire, planted almost by accident in acts of defense, piracy, and failure, had begun to germinate in the mist. The journey was just beginning. The lineage of the Tudors had consolidated an island, a kingdom of stone and mist, surrounded by a grey tide. But beyond that tide, the world was being reshaped. From the south, news arrived with the salty wind. A Spanish empire bathed in the gold of the Incas, and another Portuguese, whose spices perfumed the palaces of Lisbon. England, in the twilight of the 16th century, was a late spectator, a nation that felt the pulse of a new time, but whose hands were still empty. The gaze of its sailors, once fixed on the coasts of France or the ports of Flanders, began to turn westward, toward the vast and silent canvas of the Atlantic. There, in that apparent void, lay the echoes of a nearly forgotten journey. That of Giovanni Caboto, a Venetian in the service of an English king, who decades earlier had touched a new and cold land, believing he had found the antechamber of Cathay. He brought no silks or spices, only the tale of wooded shores and waters teeming with fish. His promise dissolved like the fog on the coast of Newfoundland, but the memory of that land remained, latent, like a seed in the long winter of English ambition. It was under the reign of Elizabeth, a queen with the cunning of her father and the heart of a lion, when that seed germinated. Necessity donned the cloak of boldness. Men like Francis Drake were not mere explorers. They are hawks of the sea, instruments of an undeclared war against the Spanish Colossus. On the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind, a splinter of English oak defying a Catholic ocean, the line between pirate and patriot blurred. His raids sought not to chart maps, but to empty holds. The shine of the silver from Potosi, stolen from the galleons under the Caribbean sun, was the first fuel of the imperial engine. Drake's voyage around the world was not a geographical feat, but an act of existential defiance. A small island could, with enough courage and steel, girdle the globe. But plunder, however profitable, does not build. The next tide of men brought with it a different ambition, deeper and more serene. Walter Raleigh, poet and courtier before sailor, did not dream of galleons but of ploughs. He dreamed of planting a piece of England under another sky, of seeing the wheat of Devon grow in the reddish soil of a new continent. His vision gave birth to Roanoke. We see the colonists disembark, their dark English woolen clothes against the green lushness of the American coast. We hear the sound of axes against ancient trees, a foreign sound in a silence that had only known the wind and the song of unknown birds. The fate of Roanoke became an elegy, a whisper in the history of the empire. There was no great battle, nor a chronicle of its end, only silence. A supply ship arriving late finds an empty settlement, the cabins consumed by weeds and, on a post, a single word carved: Croatoan. The weariness of those colonists, their hunger, their fear before the vastness of an endless forest, all was lost in that silence. Its inhabitants became a collective ghost, the first anonymous sacrifice on the altar of an imperial dream. Their failure was a lesson written in ash. The will of a king and the gold of a privateer were not enough to tame a land. Something more was needed, and that something more finally arrived on the banks of the James River. In the year 1607, Jamestown clung to life with desperate stubbornness. Its early years were a chronicle of hunger, disease, and distrust. Men who had dreamed of finding gold ended up digging graves in the frozen earth during the starving winter. But unlike Roanoke, Jamestown endured. It was an ugly and tenacious root that sank into the ground, nourished not by glory, but by the cultivation of tobacco and the formation of a company. It was the first stone, stained with mud and blood, of what would become British America. Those captains and colonists did not know they were the prologue to a vast story. They believed they fought for their god, their queen, or their own survival. But with every league sailed, with every palisade raised on the coast of Virginia, they were weaving the first threads of a network that would one day span the world. The echo of the gold stolen from the galleons began to be replaced by the more methodical and persistent murmur of contracts and shares, a sound that would soon become the true soundtrack of the empire. The echo of the caravels of the explorers had not yet faded over the distant waters, and already a new tide began to rise, silent and tenacious. It was not the roar of open conquest, nor the journey of the solitary hero in search of the unknown. It was the constant and disciplined tide of enterprise, a force that was measured not in nautical knots, but in pounds, shillings, and pence. The soul of England, forged in the mist and the green fields, was learning a new language, that of global trade. It was born in the last winter of the 16th century, in the year 1600, as an idea whispered in the stone corridors of London, while the Thames flowed slow and grey towards the sea. Queen Elizabeth, already in the twilight of her reign, signed a royal charter. With a stroke of the pen on parchment, she gave life to a creature that would surpass in power and longevity any monarch, the Honourable East India Company. At first, it was barely a consortium of bold merchants, 125 men who risked their capital in search of the spices of the East, that aromatic powder worth more than its weight in gold. Their first ships were small, vulnerable, wooden and canvas dots lost in the vastness of the Indian Ocean. Let us imagine that young Englishman, the second son of a landowner without fortune, disembarking on the coast of India. The air is dense, laden with scents he has never before perceived: cardamom, incense, the dust of an ancient path. The sun is a hammer of light striking his shoulders, accustomed to drizzle. He has not come to plant a flag, nor to convert souls. He has come to trade. He settles in a small fortified post, a factory in Surat or Madras, an islet of English customs in a sea of Mughal culture. He spends his days bent over accounting books, recording bales of cotton, sacks of pepper, and chests of tea. At night, he listens to the strange sound of a language he does not understand, and feels the weight of a solitude as vast as the ocean that separates him from home. These men, the agents of the company, were the true foundations of the empire. They learned that trade in distant lands was not just a matter of prices. It was a game of alliances, of bribes, of patience, and, when necessary, of intimidation. The company learned to speak the language of local power, presenting itself before the Mughal princes not as equals, but as humble supplicants. But in its warehouses, alongside silk and indigo, it transported the seed of a new order. It began to hire local guards, the sepoys, to protect its warehouses. Then, it fortified its trading posts. The merchant, little by little, began to carry a sword at his side. The balance of spices and the musket began to weigh the same in the equation of power. And it was not alone. To the west, on the coasts of Africa, another royal company, the Royal African Company, was mapping a darker reality over the continent. Its merchandise, sanctioned by the crown, was the most tragic of all: human beings. On its ships, the air did not smell of clove and cinnamon, but of fear and despair. This triangular trade, which connected the factories of England with the coasts of Africa and the plantations of America, became a vital and poisoned artery that pumped immense wealth into British coffers. Thus, the empire grew in an almost organic way, like moss clinging to damp stone. It was not planned from a throne. It was the result of thousands of individual decisions made in offices in London and in dusty factories halfway around the world. The wealth flowing back not only built mansions in the English countryside and financed new ventures, it also forged cannons, built warships, and paid armies. Economic power, drop by drop, was transmuting into military power. The accounting book was becoming the prelude to a book of conquests. The merchant, who had arrived with his head bowed, asking for permission to trade, was beginning to lift his gaze. In his shadow, which stretched with the setting sun of India, no longer loomed the figure of an accountant, but that of a soldier. And in the air, mixed with the aroma of spices, began to float, faint but unmistakable, the smell of gunpowder. The time of peaceful trade was coming to an end. The time of iron was approaching. The murmur of the accounting books, which had defined the previous century, began to be drowned out by a deeper and more sinister sound: the rumble of cannons. Trade had charted the routes, but it would be steel that would solidify them. The 18th century was not an era of peace built upon wealth. It was an era in which wealth became the fuel for a global conflagration. The world, which seemed to have shrunk thanks to merchant ships, revealed itself as a vast chessboard, and on it, two ancient rivals, Great Britain and France, played a life and death game for control of the future. This long and cold duel was fought in 3 distant theatres, under 3 different suns. In the misty forests of North America, British colonists, with their wind-weathered faces and the promise of their own land, looked westward toward the Ohio Valley. But there, in the shadows of ancient trees, they found not an empty land, but the presence of France and its native allies. The war that erupted, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, was for those who lived it there an intimate and brutal struggle. It was the echo of an axe in the stillness of the forest, the flash of a musket among the ferns, the fear of a young soldier from Yorkshire, shivering not only from the cold, but from the strangeness of a continent he did not understand, fighting for a king he would never see. It was not a war of great formations, but of ambushes, of silent resistance and alliances as fragile as the morning mist over the river. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, under the relentless sun of India, the same struggle took on a different hue. Here, the East India Company was no longer just a corporation of merchants. It had become a political power, a lineage of administrators and soldiers. Its chief agent, Robert Clive, was a man forged in that ambiguity, a clerk with the soul of a conqueror. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was not so much a military feat as a masterpiece of intrigue, where the betrayal of the allies of the Nawab of Bengal was a decisive factor. In the dust and chaos of that day, as war elephants ran amok in confusion, a trading company seized a kingdom. British power in India ceased to be a matter of permits and treaties. It was inscribed in the land with blood and cemented upon the ashes of local empires. The merchant and the sovereign had merged into a single and formidable figure. And then there was the Caribbean, the sugary heart of the empire. In its turquoise waters, fleets clashed over islands that were little more than floating plantations, but whose value sweetened the tea of every home in London and financed the armies fighting on other continents. Each captured island Guadeloupe, Martinique was a jewel torn from the crown of a rival, a victory felt not in territorial pride, but in the balance sheets of the banks of the city. The war here smelled of salt, gunpowder, and fermenting molasses under an eternal sun. When the thunder finally ceased with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the map of the world had been stained red. France was humiliated, stripped of its North American empire, and reduced to a shadow in India. Great Britain stood at the pinnacle of the world, owner of a dominion that spanned continents. A king in his palace in London could look at that map and feel the vertigo of absolute power. But victories, like tides, leave something behind. They left a colossal debt and a sense of exhaustion that stretched from the returning soldier to his farm to the royal treasury. And in America, the colonists who had fought alongside the redcoats now saw them not as liberators, but as overseers. The shared victory had created a new consciousness, a new question that hung in the air like smoke after the battle. Who would pay the price of this vast and heavy empire? The silence that followed the war was not one of peace, but of expectation. It was the tense calm that precedes a different storm, one that would not come from outside, but from within. The echo of victories still resonated in the stone corridors of Whitehall. After the wars of the 18th century, the British Empire seemed like a colossus carved from granite, its domains secured by the most powerful fleet the world had ever known. The maps, spread across polished oak tables, displayed a realm that stretched from the Caribbean to the Ganges. And yet, a mist began to rise from the west, a fog born not of the sea, but of ideas. Across the Atlantic, in the 13 colonies of North America, the air smelled of pine and gunpowder, of freshly ploughed earth and of freedom. Its people were no longer mere transplants from England. They were something else, a new lineage forged by cruel winters, by the silence of vast forests, and by the constant murmur of the ocean that separated them from their king. They read Locke and Montesquieu by candlelight, and their words were like seeds fallen on fertile ground. The distance was not only measured in leagues of salt water, but in the growing difference of the soul. In London, King George III, a pious and stubborn man, viewed the world through the prism of duty and hierarchy. For him, the descent of the colonists was not the cry of a new people, but the insolence of wayward children. Neither he nor his court seemed capable of understanding that the hands wielding the axe to fell a tree in Massachusetts or guiding a plow in Virginia felt the land as their own in a way that a landowner from Kent never could. The demand to not be taxed without representation was not merely a fiscal dispute. It was a fundamental question about the nature of power and identity. It was the creaking of a structure that had become too rigid. And then the thunder. The first shot at Lexington was not just the sound of iron and fire. It was the sound of a bond breaking, an umbilical cord that connected two worlds and was now fraying with irreversible violence. The war that followed was not like the European wars, fought in open fields between uniformed armies. For the British redcoats, it was a nightmare of ambushes in forests they did not understand, against an enemy that vanished into the landscape like the smoke from their own muskets. The fatigue of the soldiers was not just physical, it was the weariness of the soul in fighting against men who spoke their same language, who prayed to their same God, but who defended a dream that was incomprehensible to them. In the camps of the Continentals, the cold of winter at Valley Forge bit deeper than enemy steel. Hunger was a constant companion, but in the eyes of those ragged men burned a conviction that the king's gold could not buy. They fought for their farms, for their children, for the right to forge a destiny under their own sky. When France, England's old enemy, recognized their cause and sent its fleets and armies, the colonial conflict transformed into a world war, and the fate was sealed. The surrender at Yorktown in 1781 was a dull blow that was felt in every corner of the empire. In the halls of Westminster, the silence was heavier than any defeat on the battlefield. An entire continent, the jewel of the Atlantic crown, had been lost. It was a deep wound in the pride and soul of the empire, a lesson written in blood and ash. The First Empire, the Empire of the Atlantic, had found its twilight. But history, like the tide, rarely stops. The loss of America was not an end, but a forced metamorphosis. It compelled Great Britain to look elsewhere. The imperial energy, frustrated in the West, began to turn, slowly but inexorably, towards the East. The gaze of admirals and merchants shifted from the maple forests of New England to the golden dust of India, to the trade routes of Asia, and to the still unknown shores of a southern land in the Pacific. The ashes of the lost colonies would become the fertilizer for a new and even larger empire. An empire upon which, as they would soon begin to whisper, the sun would never set. The memory of the 13 lost colonies was a recent wound, a phantom limb whose pain still coursed through the body of the empire. But the tide of ambition, when it finds a dam, does not retreat. It seeks new channels through which to pour its strength. Thus, with the echo of defeat in America still suspended in the air, Britain's gaze shifted from west to east, toward the deep south, toward the vast silences of the map that still remained to be named. The 19th century dawned over the British Isles shrouded in the fog of coal and determination. It was no longer the era of the solitary explorer seeking the edge of the world, but that of the administrator, the engineer, and the soldier. The empire no longer stumbled upon new territories. It sought them with methodical and cold precision. The sea routes, once fragile threads stretched over an abyss, became arteries of steel through which pumped the power of a nation that was learning to dominate not only men but also matter itself. In Asia, the jewel in the crown, India ceased to be the fiefdom of a trading company to become the very heart of the imperial project. The young officer, arriving from the green and damp fields of Kent, felt the weight of the Indian sun on his red wool uniform, a heat unlike anything familiar, as he learned to govern over millions of souls whose tongues and gods were a profound mystery to him. Further east, in the Strait of Malacca, the vision of Stamford Raffles transformed a swampy, jungle-covered island into what it could be. And from that mud, Singapore was born, a heart of tin and granite that would regulate the flow of trade between two oceans. Outposts were established in Burma and Malaysia, and the smell of spices and gunpowder mingled in the humid air of the ports. And then, Africa, a continent that had slept on the periphery of European consciousness, an outline on maps bordered by legends. Now, it was becoming a board. The pale-faced administrator in an office in London or Cape Town traced with ink straight lines over curved and complex geographies, lines that divided peoples, mountains and rivers with the indifference of a geometric god. The chimera of a railway connecting Cairo to Cape Town became a fevered dream, an iron scar that was to sew the continent under a single flag. The echo of rifles in the South African veld and the sound of picks in the gold and diamond mines drowned out the ancient voices of the land. Missionaries, with faith burning in their eyes, brought their gospel to villages where time was measured by seasons and not by the relentless ticking of a pocket watch. In the vast blue of the Pacific, expansion took another form. Australia, born as a remote prison for exiles under an unrelenting sun, began to forge a new identity, a society of settlers that pushed the indigenous peoples toward oblivion, toward the arid lands of the interior. New Zealand, with its fjords and hills reminiscent of a dreamlike Scotland, was claimed, and the Maori, a people of warriors and poets, felt the cold embrace of a treaty that, as so often, promised more than it granted. Then arose the phrase, laden with an almost blasphemous pride, that the sun never set on the British Empire. It was a geographical truth. When twilight tinged the waters of Jamaica violet, dawn was already gilding the pagodas of Mandalay. But it was also a darker truth, a sun that offered no rest, a perpetual vigilance, a light that, while illuminating everything, also cast the longest and deepest shadows over the lives it transformed. The lives of ordinary people changed forever. The rhythm of the harvest was replaced by the whistle of the factory, the council of elders by the decree of the district commissioner. The stone of the new government buildings settled upon the land with a permanence that seemed eternal. But this colossal expansion, this net that ensnared islands and continents, was not sustained solely by the blood of soldiers or the audacity of bureaucrats. Something more propelled it, a new and terrible force born in the very heart of England. In the valleys of Lancashire and on the banks of the Clyde, a new pulse began to beat with an unknown power, a pulse of iron and steam, of gears and pistons that would give the empire the means not only to conquer the world, but to remake it in its own image and likeness. The sun, we have been told, never set on that empire that spread like a stain of ink across the map of the 19th century. But beneath that relentless sun, in the very heart of the island that birthed it, another sun rose, darker and more earthly. The orange glow of the blast furnaces, a light that promised a power on a scale never before dreamed. The expansion we saw born in distant seas found its true engine not in the audacity of its sailors, but in the smoke and ash of its own cities. Before the roar changed everything, England was a land of green silences, governed by the ancient rhythm of sowing and harvesting. Time was measured by the sun and the seasons. The dominant sound was that of the wind on the moors and the echo of church bells in the valley. But something began to change, first as a murmur, then as a roar. It was the sound of water channeled, of the wheel turning, of coal extracted from the bowels of the earth. The Industrial Revolution was not an event, but a slow and powerful tide that eroded the old world and laid upon its ruins the foundations of a new one. In the valleys of Lancashire and Yorkshire, the air, once clean and misty, thickened with soot. Chimneys like stone fingers rose toward a grey sky, and the murmur of the streams was drowned by the incessant clatter of the mechanical looms. Men and women, whose ancestors had tilled the same plot of land for generations, abandoned the countryside. They left behind the open horizon for a labyrinth of narrow, damp streets, trading the tyranny of the weather for that of the factory clock. Their lives, once dictated by daylight, were now measured in 14-hour shifts, in service of a machine that never tired. There was no king who decreed this revolution. Its architects were men like Richard Arkwright, a barber with a restless mind, who imagined how to mechanize cotton spinning, or James Watt, who did not invent the steam engine but perfected it until it became the iron and fire heart of this new era. They were not conquerors in armor, but engineers and entrepreneurs, practical men who saw in steam and gears a way to multiply the strength of a human arm to infinity. And in that multiplication resided the secret of the new imperial power. Suddenly, Great Britain became the workshop of the world. Its factories could produce textiles, tools, and weapons at a speed and cost that no other nation could match. The empire, which until then had been a network of trading posts and naval bases, transformed into an integrated system. Raw cotton from India or the plantations of America fed the looms of Manchester, and the cheap fabrics that emerged from them returned to India, flooding its markets and forever silencing the whisper of thousands of hand looms. It was a silent conquest, waged not with cannons, but with bales of goods. And yet, the cannons also changed. The same furnaces that melted iron for bridges and railway tracks forged a new generation of armaments. The Royal Navy, which had dominated the seas with wooden ships and sails, began to build ironclad warships powered by steam. Vessels like the Nemesis, which ascended the rivers of China during the Opium Wars, were apparitions from another world, immune to winds and currents, exhaling smoke. Their presence was the embodiment of overwhelming technological superiority. The fatigue of the oarsman and the uncertainty of the wind, so human, were replaced by the relentless certainty of the machine. Thus, the Industrial Revolution not only financed the empire, it provided the tools for its expansion and control. A soldier in a remote fort on the northwest frontier wore a uniform woven in Leeds, fired a rifle manufactured in Birmingham, and his position communicated to London through telegraph wires laid with the same industrial logic. Power no longer resided solely in the bravery of a regiment or the cunning of a general, but in the capacity to produce, transport, and project material force on a massive scale. The smoke from those chimneys in northern England spread across the globe, casting a long and complex shadow. From an office in London, a man could now trace on a map the arteries of this new global body, the routes of steamships, the railway lines cutting through continents. The empire had become a vast and complex organism, a machine of unprecedented scale. But such a machine requires constant management. It requires hands, laws, and a bureaucracy capable of governing not just a handful of colonies, but a world woven with thread and forged in fire. The echo of the hammer in the shipyards of Glasgow and the whistle of steam in the factories of Manchester, which we spoke of earlier, did not fade away with the arrival of night. They transformed. Their energy, converted into copper wires stretched beneath the ocean and steam arteries coursing through the tides, now fed a creature of an unprecedented scale. An empire that did not sleep, because the sun never dared to abandon it. But how does one govern a ghost? How does one administer a quarter of the globe from a small, misty island, often wrapped in a pale, milky light? Not with the sword, for the sword rusts, and the hand that wields it grows weary. Not solely with the cannon, for its roar fades away and leaves behind a silence pregnant with resentment. The British Empire, in its maturity, was governed with something more enduring and, in its own way, more relentless. It was governed with paper. Imagine the scribe in an office in Whitehall, in the heart of London. An anonymous man hunched over a mahogany desk with the smell of ink, rain, and coal embedded in his woolen jacket. With the stroke of his pen on parchment, he decided the route of a railway in Punjab, the salt tax that a peasant would pay in Bengal, or the appointment of a tribal chief on the African Gold Coast. For him, the empire was an abstraction, a series of columns in an accounting book, a map coloured red. He did not feel the dust of the road, nor the heat that cracks the earth, only the damp cold that seeped through the window. And then imagine at the other end of that line of ink, the young colonial administrator, fresh from Oxford or Cambridge, with his head filled with Greek classics and a sense of duty as rigid as the starched collar of his shirt. He was sent to a remote district in India, to a dusty plain in Sudan, under a sky of a violent blue that his eyes were not accustomed to seeing. There, thousands of kilometers from home, this young man became a king without a crown. He was judge, tax collector, engineer, and sometimes executioner. He felt the weight of the sun and solitude like armor. He learned to read the silence of the natives, a silence that could be respect, fear, or hatred. The system that these men served was a complex fabric of pragmatism and arrogance, where they found ancient and sophisticated power structures, such as in the India of the princes, they often left them standing. It was the so-called indirect rule, a subtle form of control that consisted of leaving the throne in place but emptying it of its former soul, turning the Raja or Emir into an echo of his own authority, dependent on the favour of the British resident. The facade was maintained, the local colour, while true sovereignty had moved to London. where they did not find such structures or where they deemed them too primitive, they imposed direct rule. They erased the ancient lines of power with the ink of a new law. They divided lands that had always been united and united peoples that had always been enemies, drawing borders with the cold, straight logic of a cartographer, indifferent to the mountains, rivers, or blood ties that challenged their lines. Thus, the imperial machinery was perfected. Steamships transported not only soldiers, but also officials, reports, and directives. The telegraph transmitted orders in minutes across continents, eliminating the doubt and autonomy that distance once granted to governors. Railways were built, iron scars across ancient landscapes, not to unite people, but to transport troops swiftly and to bleed the resources of the land toward the ports. An order was created, an imperial peace, but it was the piece of a chessboard, where each piece moves according to rules dictated by an invisible and distant hand. It was the silence of a field freshly ploughed by a foreign blade. The scaffolding was in place, the great machinery of stone and protocol, efficient and dispassionate, hummed across the world. The structure, vast and cold, now awaited a face, a symbol that would give it a meaning beyond accounting books and maps. And on the horizon, in the very heart of the empire, a young woman ascended to the throne, not yet knowing that her name would be forever etched at the pinnacle of that era. From the offices of Whitehall, shrouded in the perpetual fog of London, the world no longer seemed a place of unfathomable mysteries, but rather a vast chessboard. The structures of government we have discussed, those gears of laws, commerce, and bureaucracy, had reached their maximum efficiency. Now, at the heart of that machinery, sat a figure who would name not only an era, but also a mentality, a way of understanding the world. A young woman named Victoria. When she ascended to the throne in 1837, she was almost a child, heir to a lineage of monarchs and to an empire that grew with the force of a spring tide. Her reign, the longest in the history of her nation up to that point, would become the anchor of a century of dizzying changes. She herself transformed, from the young queen in love to the perpetual widow dressed in mourning, the stern and familiar face of an imperial matron. In her figure, the British people saw the reflection of their own seriousness, their duty, and their resilience. She was the cornerstone upon which the trust of an entire nation was built. This was the era when the sun truly never set on the British domains. The map of the world was stained red, not with the fury of a single battle, but with the slow and persistent blot of influence. The ink of treaties and the steam of ships were more powerful weapons than any cannon. The Pax Britannica, a peace imposed by the uncontestable supremacy of the Royal Navy, allowed maritime routes to become the arteries of a global body. Through them flowed the jute of India, the gold of Australia, the wool of New Zealand, and the timber of Canada, all converging at the docks of Liverpool and London. In 1851, the empire celebrated itself in a cathedral of glass and iron. The Crystal Palace, erected in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition, was more than a building. It was a statement. Within its transparent walls, the entire world seemed to have been tamed and catalogued. Machines weaving with the precision of a steel spider, diamonds extracted from the depths of the African earth, silks whispering stories of a distant east. It was the zenith of confidence, the unshakable belief in progress, and in the manifest destiny of the Anglo-Saxon race to lead it. But this story is not only about kings and ministers, it is also the story of the engineer from Manchester, with a face covered in soot, who felt in his hands the power to transform iron into motion. It is that of the private soldier on the northwest frontier, who felt the weight of the foreign sun on his red coat and wondered if he would see the drizzle of his homeland again. It is that of the colonial official, who in the solitude of his post on a hill in Ceylon, battled the heat and melancholy by writing letters that would take months to reach home. And on the other side of the ledger, it is the story of worlds that were fading away. The echo of ancient songs was drowned out by the roar of the railway. Ancestral paths were erased by the straight line of a road. Time, once measured by the seasons and the harvests, was now governed by the factory clock and the train schedule. For millions, the empire was not a promise of progress, but the end of a silence, the end of a way of being that had remained unchanged for generations. The power that built a new era in London was dismantling worlds elsewhere. The Victorian Empire at its peak was a construction of astonishing complexity, a mix of pride and pragmatism, of genuine belief in civilization and of often brutal greed. It rested on certainty in its technology, in its faith, in its system of government, and above all, in its right to rule. Power, when it reaches such heights, needs a gospel, a moral justification that goes beyond mere profit. And that justification was already being forged, an idea as heavy and enduring as the crown itself. The notion of a burden, a sacred responsibility that would cast a shadow as vast as the empire itself. And so, at the top of the world, the empire was not content with merely possessing the land. It needed to possess reason as well. The echo of cannons and the murmur of treaties had given way to a deeper silence, the silence in which a civilization asks not only what it has done, but why. The map of the world, stained with imperial red from the snows of Canada to the plains of India, was a fact set in stone. But every stone needs a foundation, and that of the Victorian Empire was built upon an idea as powerful as it was fragile, that of a divine mission, a manifest destiny. It was no longer just the ambition of a king or the greed of a company. Now it was a faith, a secular doctrine preached from the lecterns of Oxford and whispered in the gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall amidst the smoke of tobacco and the clinking of glass. They gave it a name taken from the verses of a poet born in Bombay, Rudyard Kipling, The Burden of the White Man, a poem that was both a hymn, a warning, and a justification. It spoke of a solemn, almost sacred duty to govern newly conquered peoples, half demons and half children, an ungrateful task filled with sacrifice, whose only reward was the silent judgment of peers and the resentment of those whom they sought to elevate. This idea did not arise in a vacuum. It floated in the air of the time, nourished by science in its arrogant youth. The social Darwinism of thinkers such as Herbert Spencer applied, with brutal logic, the survival of the fittest to nations and races. British expansion was therefore not a conquest, but the manifestation of a natural law. They were the strongest, the most organized, the most civilized. Their rule was not a choice, but a biological inevitability, a further step in the inexorable march of progress. Let us imagine for a moment the young colonial administrator, freshly disembarked at a port in West Africa. The air is dense, humid, laden with unfamiliar smells. He carries in his suitcase a manual of British laws, a Bible, and an unshakable faith in the superiority of his culture. He does not see himself as an oppressor. He sees himself as a bearer of light. He comes to build bridges, to lay iron paths over untamed geographies, to eradicate diseases, and to replace what he considers superstition with logic and Christian faith. He feels the weight of the burden, the loneliness of his position, the fatigue under an unrelenting sun. He feels like a silent martyr of progress. But on the other side of that conviction, there is another reality. What did the elderly tribal chief feel upon seeing his traditions, forged over generations to the rhythm of the seasons and spirits, declared illegal by a young foreigner who barely understands his language? What did the scholar from Benares think, whose library housed manuscripts of millennia-old philosophical subtlety, when told that true wisdom resided in the poems of Shakespeare and the economics of Adam Smith? The burden of the white man was, for those who bore it upon their shoulders, an immense weight. The railway cutting through the jungle was not merely iron and steam. It was a scar of order imposed upon a land of ancestral rhythms. The missionary school did not just teach reading, it taught forgetting. This ideology, a mix of sincere paternalism, racial arrogance, and economic pragmatism, became the moral lubricant of the imperial machinery. It allowed decent men to commit acts of systematic cruelty, not with hatred, but with the cold certainty of doing what was right, pacifying a rebellious village, imposing taxes on harvests that barely provided for survival, dismantling entire social structures. All was done in the name of a greater good, of a civilized future that only they could envision. And in that certainty lay their greatest danger. Because when an idea as noble as civilization becomes a tool, it can be used to justify any end. The burden could be that of bringing medicine and law, but it could also be that of forcibly opening markets, even when the goods imposed were not salvation, but poison. On the horizon, beyond India, rose the veiled coasts of China, an ancient and proud empire that considered itself the center of the world. British ships were already sailing there, and in their holds they carried not Bibles or vaccines, but the dark and addictive weight of opium chests. The burden was about to reveal its most cynical face.
I have a small favor to ask. Many travel through these stories, but few decide to stay. If these tales help you rest or uncover the past, please consider subscribing. It is a free gesture for you, but it is the only way we keep the flame of history alive. My promise is to keep bringing you the greatest mysteries every single week. Thank you for being part of the world's memory.
The idea of a civilizing mission, the burden that the white man had imposed upon himself with solemn gravity, found its darkest and most profitable expression in the dense and sweet smoke of opium. If the previous chapter was the philosophical justification of the empire, this is the echo of its broken conscience, the sound of iron striking silver through a poison wrapped in the Union flag. We delve into a fog that is not of London, but one that rises from the coasts of China, carrying with it the aroma of poppy and the foreboding of war. By the mid-19th century, the Middle Kingdom, the Qing dynasty, considered itself the axis of the world. For centuries, it had regarded the barbarians of the West with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Its silks, its tea, its porcelain were treasures that Europe longed for, paying for them with an incessant torrent of silver that emptied British coffers. The British Empire, master of industry and the seas, found itself in a humiliating negative trade balance. They had nothing that the Celestial Empire wanted to buy. Nothing except a narcotic cultivated in the fertile fields of British India. The East India Company, with the tacit approval of the Crown, began to flood China with opium. It was a trade of dreams and death, and it was immensely lucrative. We see the image: junks gliding stealthily through the Pearl River Delta, their holds laden not with spices, but with a plague. We see the faces of addicts in the opium dens of Canton, their bodies consumed, their futures turned to ash. And we see Emperor Daoguang, in the solitude of the Forbidden City, feeling the tremor of his vast realm, a sick giant whose armies and officials were dissolving in the indolence of opium. In his desperation, he was not an arrogant despot, but a father watching his family being poisoned. His will took the form of a man, Commissioner Lin Zexu, an official of steel integrity, sent to Canton with the order to eradicate the trade. Lin did not negotiate. He acted with the force of a celestial mandate. In 1839, he confiscated more than 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants and, in an act of symbolic purification, destroyed them, dissolving them with lime and salt in trenches open to the tide. For China, it was an act of sovereignty. For Britain, it was a casus belli. The destruction of property was the insult, the defense of free trade, the justification. What followed was not a war between equals, it was the clash of two eras. The British steam gunboats, like the formidable Nemesis, ascended the Chinese rivers with terrifying ease, their explosive projectiles shattering the antiquated war junks and stone fortresses. The thunder of British cannons, echoing in valleys that had only known the silence of monks and the whisper of the wind, was the sound of a new century coming to demolish an old one. The Qing soldier, with his saber and his arquebus, faced an enemy whose technology seemed almost supernatural. The weariness of those soldiers was not only physical, it was the spiritual exhaustion of watching their world crumble. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842 on the deck of a British warship, was a wound etched in the soul of China. It was not an agreement, it was an imposition. The cession of the island of Hong Kong, the forced opening of 5 ports to foreign trade, and the payment of a crushing indemnity. It was the first of the unequal treaties, the beginning of what China would call its century of humiliation. A second war, even more brutal, would culminate in the march of British and French troops on Beijing and the burning of the old Summer Palace, a pyre of art and culture whose smoke would be seen from the walls of the Forbidden City. The opium trade continued, now legalized. British control over Asian routes was absolute. The silver that had once flowed into China now returned to London, stained by the sap of the poppy. The empire had demonstrated that its power did not reside solely in industry or administration, but in the willingness to use overwhelming force to bend a millennia-old civilization to its economic interests. But the gears of the empire were connected in complex and often tragic ways. The opium that subjugated China was cultivated in India. The soldiers who fought under the British flag in the Opium Wars were, in many cases, Indian sepoys. That soldier, standing on the deck of a ship on the Yangtze River, smelling gunpowder and burnt incense, could not know that the very wind carrying the thunder of war across China would soon blow like a hurricane over the fields of his own land. The tension was building, silent as the moss growing over stone, waiting for the spark that would ignite it all. From the shores of China, where the smoke of cannon still lingered over the ports, the tide of British power seemed unstoppable, a force of history rewriting maps and destinies. But every empire, no matter how vast, rests on foundations that can crack. In 1857, the ground of India trembled, and for a terrifying moment, the entire imperial edifice appeared on the verge of collapse. For a century, the East India Company, that strange creature born of trade and armed with armies, had been extending its tentacles across the subcontinent. It ruled not with the majesty of a sovereign, but with the cold efficiency of an accountant. It annexed kingdoms with contractual clauses, overthrew princes with debts, and maintained peace with armies of sepoys, Indian soldiers under British command. It was a fragile peace, the stillness of a field before the storm, charged with an invisible electricity. The air smelled of spices and gunpowder, of monsoons and discontent. The soul of a man, however, is not governed by decrees nor pacified by salaries. And it was in the soul of the sepoy where the first spark ignited. The rumour came like a cold wind through the stifling barracks. The new cartridges for the Enfield rifle, that marvel of British military technology, were greased. Greased, it was said, with cow fat, sacred to Hindus, and pig lard, impure for Muslims. To load the weapon, the soldier had to bite the cartridge. It was an order that asked a man to choose between his duty and his faith, between his life and his eternity. For the British officer, often young and oblivious to the deep spiritual rivers flowing beneath his feet, it was a matter of discipline. For the sepoy, it was a desecration, a poison to the soul. What began as a whisper, as a silent refusal in a parade ground, erupted into a mutiny at the Meerut garrison in the stifling heat of May. It was the last straw in a cup already full of grievances. Princes stripped of their lands, social reforms that seemed to attack ancestral traditions, and the arrogance of a culture that believed itself superior. The mutiny became a fire that, fueled by the winds of resentment, devoured the northern plains. Delhi, the ancient Mughal capital, fell into the hands of the rebels. The elderly emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, a melancholic poet who ruled over a kingdom of shadows, was pulled from his retirement and proclaimed, against his will, the symbol of a united India against the foreigner. The rebellion was not a war of clear fronts, but a chaos of broken loyalties, desperate sieges, and a brutality that engulfed both sides. In Cawnpore, the promise of a safe conduct turned into a massacre that chilled British blood. In Lucknow, a small garrison held out for months, its suffering transformed into a legend of imperial courage. And on the plains of Jhansi, a widowed queen named Lakshmi Bai, to whom the company had denied her son's right to rule, rode with her sword drawn, her figure becoming the eternal echo of a desperate resistance. The British response, once the initial shock had passed, was relentless. What the Indians themselves called the Devil's Wind was unleashed, a campaign of fierce retribution that did not distinguish between combatants and civilians. Entire villages were razed. Captured rebels were tied to the mouths of cannons, a Mughal punishment adopted with a cold and terrible irony. When the last ember was extinguished and a silence of ashes and graves fell over northern India, the political landscape had changed forever. The East India Company, deemed incompetent to govern what it had conquered, exhaled its last breath. The British Parliament dissolved its charter and assumed direct control. The veil of trade had been torn, revealing the naked face of the empire. In 1858, Queen Victoria was proclaimed sovereign of India. The Raj had begun. The rebellion had failed, but its memory was seared into the consciousness of both nations. For the British, it was a lesson on the precariousness of their rule, a wound to their pride that bred distrust and a more authoritarian government. For the Indians, it was the first and bloody awakening of a national identity, a tragedy whose echo would resonate for 90 years until the dawn of independence. The jewel of the crown was now firmly set, and its protection became an obsession. The empire, having stared into the abyss of its own fragility, lifted its gaze beyond the smoking plains, towards the northern mountains, towards the frozen passes of the Hindu Kush. There, in the distance, another shadow stretched, that of the Russian bear. A new board was being prepared, silent and vast. The great game was about to begin. The ashes of the rebellion in India were still warm in the air, a dusty reminder of the fragility of an empire, when a new shadow, long and cold, began to cast itself from the north. The crown, having felt the tremor beneath its feet in Delhi and Lucknow, now lifted its gaze beyond the snow-covered walls of the Hindu Kush towards the vast and silent steppes of Central Asia. There, another empire, the Russian, moved with the patient and ominous slowness of a glacier, expanding its borders southward. And in the uncertain space that separated these two tides of power, a game without a board or clear rules would begin to unfold, a contest of whispers, maps, and steel, remembered by the echo of history as the Great Game. The setting was a backdrop of desolate grandeur, deserts that burned by day and froze by night, mountain ranges so high they seemed to scratch the void of the sky, and ancient khanates whose names Khiva, Bukhara, Samarkand resounded in the offices of London and St. Petersburg like echoes of a legend. For the men of the Tsar, this expansion was a manifest destiny, a civilizing mission that pushed their borders towards warm water ports. For the men of Queen Victoria, it was an existential threat. Each Russian advance on the map was a step closer to the jewel in the crown, to that India they had just pacified with blood and fire. The fear of a Russian invasion, however improbable, became a fever that dictated the politics of a generation. The actors in this drama were not massive armies clashing on open plains. They were, more often, solitary figures silhouetted against an infinite horizon. They were young British officers, disguised as merchants or Muslim scholars, with sun-tanned skin and eyes filled with the tension of a double life. Men like Alexander Burns, bold and charismatic, who ventured into the heart of Afghanistan and whose life would end tragically at the hands of a mob in Kabul, a harbinger of the blood that would cost that game board. They were explorers and cartographers who risked their lives to chart a river or measure the altitude of a mountain pass, knowing that their lines drawn in ink would decide the movement of future columns of soldiers. On the other side, their Russian counterparts did the same, advancing with relentless determination, signing treaties with local emirs, building forts, and extending the reach of the double-headed eagle. The action was not a war, but a tournament of shadows. A diplomatic mission to the court of the Emir of Afghanistan became a battle of wits and bribes. The construction of a telegraph line was a strategic act. The Russian annexation of a Khanate in 1873 provoked panic in Calcutta and heated discussions in Parliament. The soldiers, when they marched, did not do so towards a glorious victory, but towards isolated garrisons, feeling the weight of the rifle, the cold of the stone of the forts, and a loneliness as vast as the landscape that surrounded them. For the peoples of Afghanistan, Persia, and the tribes of the steppe, this game was a calamity. Their lands, their alliances, and their lineages became the pieces with which two distant powers played. Their destinies decided in carpeted salons thousands of kilometers away. The consequence was the creation of artificial borders that endure as scars on the land. Afghanistan was shaped by force as a buffer state, a realm of thorns and mountains destined to keep the two giants apart. A legacy of distrust was established that would poison international relations for decades. And for the British Empire, this obsession with the defense of India confirmed that its power, though immense, was anchored to a perpetual anxiety. The sun never set, it is true, but in the offices of Whitehall there was always a map on the wall, with pins marking the slow advance of a shadow in the north, a constant reminder that even the greatest empires sleep with one eye open. But while gazes were fixed on the gorges of the Hindu Kush, another continent, vast and veiled, began to call the attention of cartographers and chancellors of Europe. A rumour grew in the ports and in the stock exchanges, the rumour of Africa. As the shadow of the great game lengthened and faded over the steppes of Asia, the tide of imperial power sought new shores. The echo of British and Russian boots in the Afghan ravines faded away, but the silence did not last. Another land, vast and shrouded in a veil of mystery for the European mind, called with the promise of riches and the pretext of a mission. Africa, the heart of a continent that had beaten to its own rhythm for millennia, would soon feel the cold touch of steel and the rule of the surveyor. It was a time of feverish anxiety. Belgium, through the personal and unrestrained ambition of its King Leopold, had plunged its hands into the Congo basin. France advanced from the west, Portugal reaffirmed its ancient coastal claims, and the British Empire, with its eyes set on Egypt and a secure route to India, felt the urgency to secure its share. The race had begun, chaotic and dangerous, a stampede of nations threatening to turn the African jungles and savannas into a European battlefield. It was then that a man, who felt no particular affection for the colonies, decided to impose order on the chaos. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of a newly unified Germany, observed the contest with the cold patience of a blacksmith. He did not dream of palm trees and distant suns. He dreamed of the balance of power in a Europe of stone and steel. And that race for Africa, in his view, was a spark too close to a powder keg. He summoned the powers to his city, to Berlin. In the winter of 1884, as the icy fog clung to the windows of the Radziwill Palace, 14 nations sat at a table. There were no African kings, no tribal chiefs, no elders who knew the secrets of the land. Only European statesmen, dressed in the sober dark wool of diplomacy, with the smell of sealing wax and quiet power permeating the room. On the table, spread out like a body for autopsy, lay the map of Africa. The Berlin Conference was not a slaughter of conquest, but perhaps something more terrible. It was an act of bureaucracy. With the cold geometry of a cartographer, straight borders were drawn over curved geographies, over sacred rivers and ancestral paths. Lineages, languages, enmities, and alliances that had woven the life of the continent for centuries were ignored. The same people could be divided by an arbitrary line of pencil. Rival kingdoms, locked together within a new colonial cage. Rules were established, not to protect Africans, but to prevent Europeans from annihilating each other. The principle of effective occupation was agreed upon. It was not enough to plant a flag on the coast. A power had to demonstrate that it administered the territory. The objectives of ending the slave trade and bringing the light of civilization and commerce to the dark regions were invoked, with a solemnity that history would judge hypocritical. But the true light they sought was the shine of gold, diamonds, rubber, and ivory, and the true burden they imposed was not that of the white man, but that of an entire continent, whose millennial pulse was silenced and subjected to the logic of a European atlas. For Great Britain, the conference was a pragmatic success. Its interests in the Nile, vital for the control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, were secured. Its presence in the south and east was consolidated. The empire, which already stretched under all skies, now cast its shadow over new lands, formalizing a dominance that until then had been more informal and dispersed. The diplomats returned home, to their chimneys and their reports, satisfied to have avoided a war. But in Africa, the real conflict was just beginning. The lines drawn in Berlin were nothing more than ghosts on a map. To make them real, soldiers, administrators, taxes, and weapons would be needed. It would require breaking the will of those who had not been consulted. The silence of the Berlin salons would soon be replaced by the sound of iron in the villages, by the lament of the stripped peoples, and by the echo of a resistance that would rise from the ashes of their kingdoms. And in the far south of the continent, where the dust smelled of diamonds and two peoples of European origin already looked at each other with ancient suspicion, the lines drawn in Berlin would soon prove to be mere suggestions. The ink on the paper would not stop the blood on the land. The map of Africa, freshly drawn in the salons of Berlin, was a work of straight lines and bold colors, a fantasy of order imposed upon a continent of untamed geographies. But the ink of treaties rarely dries without being stained by blood. And as the 19th century exhaled its last breaths, the British Empire, at the peak of its Victorian autumn, would find in southern Africa a land that would refuse to be tamed by the mere signature of a diplomat. There, under an unyielding blue sky, over the vast and silent expanse of the veld, the logic of empire would clash against a rock of faith and gunpowder. We find ourselves in South Africa, a land of ochre dust and infinite horizons. Here, not only do the native tribes dwell, caught in the gears of two white worlds, but also the Boers, the farmers. Descendants of the first Dutch settlers, they were a people forged in isolation and adversity, men of ancient lineage and austere faith. Their homeland was not a global empire, but the land beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. Their law, the one they read in the Bible, their king, a stern God who had promised them that land. They saw the British not as civilizers, but as intruders, a red tide threatening to drown their hard-won independence in the Great Trek, their exodus inland. The first clash, in 1880, had been brief and humiliating for the Crown, a lesson in irregular warfare that the proud British Army, accustomed to pitched battles, learned painfully on the hill of Majuba. But time brought a new catalyst, more powerful than wounded pride: gold. The discovery of the richest deposits in the world in the Witwatersrand, in the heart of the Boer Republic of Transvaal, unleashed a fever that no treaty could contain. Men like Cecil Rhodes, who dreamed of an Africa painted in imperial red from Cairo to Cape Town, saw in gold not only wealth, but the fuel for their manifest destiny. The empire, which had looked with some disdain at those republics of farmers, now coveted them with feverish intensity. And so, in 1899, war returned. It was not a war of cavalry charges and flags in the wind. It was a rough, modern and cruel conflict. At first, the world watched in astonishment as the Boer commandos, citizens on horseback without a formal uniform, inflicted defeat after defeat on the professional forces of the largest empire on earth. They were ghosts in their own land, masters of ambush and terrain. The British soldier, the Tommy Atkins, far from home, with his khaki uniform barely visible against the dust, learned to fear the dry crack of the Mauser rifle, a sound that could come from any hill, from any rock. The British response was overwhelming and methodical. Under the command of Lord Roberts, and later the relentless Lord Kitchener, the conflict transformed. It was no longer about winning battles, but about breaking the will of a people. A scorched earth policy was implemented. Farms were burned, livestock sacrificed. And to cut the support of the population for the guerrillas, concentration camps were created. They were not extermination camps like those that would overshadow the next century, but places of indescribable misery. Tens of thousands of Boer women and children, and also thousands of black Africans, were crammed into unsanitary conditions. Hunger and disease became more lethal weapons than bullets. The news of these camps shocked public opinion in Britain, opening a deep moral wound in the imperial psyche. The burden of the white man revealed itself as a heavy and stained cross. The war ended in 1902 with a British victory, but it was a victory with the bitter taste of ash. The cost had been immense in lives, money and prestige. The conflict had exposed the deficiencies of the army and fractured the blind trust of the Victorian era. For South Africa, peace among whites sealed the fate of the black majority, excluding it from the new order and sowing the seeds of a century of pain and segregation that will be known as apartheid. The sun of the empire, which boasted of never setting, now cast long and twisted shadows. Confidence had been replaced by a silent doubt. In the stillness that followed the war, in the dust settling over the South African veld, a change in the air of the world could be felt. The echo of rifles in Africa was a prologue, a dress rehearsal for a form of industrial and total war that would soon consume not only a distant colony, but the very heart of Europe. The old certainties of the 19th century were slowly dying, and the roar of a much greater storm was already brewing on the horizon. The echo of rifles in the South African veld had barely faded when the world was enveloped in a dense calm, like that which precedes a summer storm. The British Empire, vast and self-assured, rested on the laurels of a century of supremacy. The foundation of its institutions seemed eternal. The moss of tradition covered every crack. In London, the smoke from industrial chimneys mingled with the fog of the Thames, and in the offices of Whitehall, serious-faced men pulled the strings of a third of the planet, convinced of the permanence of their work. It was a world governed by the telegraph, steam, and certainty. And then From a forgotten corner of the Balkans, in Sarajevo, the crack of a trigger resonated to the shores of Dover. An archduke was dying, and with him, an old order. The alliances, woven with ties of royal blood and ancestral distrust, were strained to the breaking point. King George V, a man of duty more than vision, watched helplessly as his cousins, the Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar of Russia, dragged Europe toward the abyss. It was not a war desired by the majority, but an inevitable catastrophe, the final tide of a century of rivalries. When the guns of August 1914 began to roar, the call was not only for the sons of Kent or the Highlands. The call of the Empire was an echo that crossed oceans. It reached the valleys of the Indus and the Ganges, where young sepoys left their ploughs to don khaki. It resonated in the farms of Canada, whose men enlisted to defend a motherland that many had never seen. It reached the shores of Australia and New Zealand, where imperial duty felt like an unbreakable lineage. More than 2.5 million men from the colonies and dominions would respond to the call. The empire was not just a map colored red. It was a reservoir of blood and iron. But this was not a war of cavalry charges and red coats. It was an industrial war, anonymous and brutal. The sticky, cold mud of Flanders had an insatiable thirst for lives. The soldier, whether from Glasgow or Lahore, sank into the same trench, listening to the same whistling of projectiles, breathing the same yellowish chemical breath of mustard gas. In the terrifying stillness between bombardments, fatigue was a weight greater than that of the rifle. The thought was not for the king or glory, but for the memory of a green field, the touch of a crumpled letter in the pocket, the face of a beloved one a world away. On the beaches of Gallipoli, under an unrelenting sun and amidst the buzzing of flies, the sons of Australia and New Zealand, the Anzac, stormed impossible cliffs. They did not find the victory that had been promised to them, but the birth of a national identity forged in sand and blood. In the sands of Mesopotamia and Palestine, Indian soldiers fought against the Ottoman Empire, while figures like Lawrence of Arabia, part legend, part strategist, wove promises of freedom to the Arab peoples, planting seeds of future conflicts. In the end, after 4 long winters, silence returned to the battlefields, a silence populated by white crosses. The empire had won the war. Its borders even expanded with the spoils of the German and Ottoman empires. But it was a victory of ashes. An entire generation of its best men lay beneath foreign soil. The economic debt was overwhelming. Great Britain, the banker of the world, was now a debtor nation. But the deepest change was intangible, like a shift in light after an eclipse. The soldiers from the colonies returned home. They had fought alongside the white man, had seen his fear, his courage, and his mortality. They had seen him bleed and die in the same mud. The cornerstone of supremacy, the supposed racial superiority and inherent nature had cracked irreparably. They had heard of the self-determination of nations, a promise whispered by the American President Wilson, and the word resonated in their hearts with the force of a revelation. The empire had demanded a sacrifice of blood from its children, and now those children would begin to ask for the price of their loyalty. The sun had not yet set on the empire, but for the first time on the horizon, the long cold shadows of twilight were beginning to take shape. An expectant silence settled over the world, the silence that precedes not peace, but the accounting of losses. The echo of the cannons had faded over the fields of Flanders, but the silence it left was not one of peace, but of exhaustion. Victory tasted like ash. The British Empire, which had sent its sons from the valleys of Wales to the plains of Punjab, emerged from the Great War with more territory than ever, a wounded giant standing over a world in ruins. But the bloodshed had watered not only the poppies, but also the seeds of an irrevocable change. It was a suspended time, a long and deep breath between two cataclysms. In London, the light of the 1920s seemed bright, a feverish dance on the edge of the abyss. The clinking of ice in champagne glasses and the syncopated rhythm of jazz tried to drown out the memory of the trenches. But beyond the salons of Mayfair, in the industrial cities of the north, the smoke from the chimneys was becoming scarcer. The men who had survived mustard gas were now queuing for a piece of bread, their medals stored in a drawer alongside broken dreams. The industrial machinery that had armed the empire was now coming to a halt, rusting under a persistent drizzle. The world no longer functioned as it once did. Then, in 1929, from the other side of the Atlantic, a cold wind blew that froze the planet. The Great Depression was not a battle of steel and fire, but a silent war fought in the accounting books, in the empty ports, and in the vacant gazes of the unemployed. Gold, that golden anchor that had stabilized the might of the pound sterling, became an unsustainable burden. In 1931, Great Britain abandoned the gold standard, an act that resonated like the bell of a sinking ship. The empire, which had preached free trade as a gospel, entrenched itself behind tariff barriers, attempting to create an economic fortress with its colonies and dominions. It was a gesture of defense, the retreat of a beast that senses its own weakness. As the politicians in Westminster, men like Stanley Baldwin and Ramsay MacDonald, struggled with figures that refused to add up, other forces, older and deeper, stirred. In India, a small and fragile man, dressed in a simple khadi of cotton, began to walk. Mohandas Gandhi bore no weapons. His only strength was a conviction that imperial logic could not comprehend. In 1930, his march to the sea to collect a handful of salt was an act of devastating simplicity. He challenged the crown's monopoly over such a basic element as salt, and in doing so, exposed the artificial nature of the entire imperial edifice. The dry sound of his sandals on the parched earth was, for the Raj, more deafening than an armed rebellion. Every step he took was a hammer blow against the foundations of British rule. The structure of the empire was also transforming from within. The blood shared in war had changed the relationship between the motherland and its white settler dominions. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa were no longer obedient children, but partners who had paid a terrible price. The Statute of Westminster of 1931 was the stone recognition of this new reality. It was not a break, but a loosening of the ties. It created the Commonwealth of Nations, AA, brotherhood of equals under the crown, an attempt to preserve influence through consent rather than coercion. The sun, it was said, never set on the empire. Now, it was beginning to set on the very idea of empire. Thus passed those interwar years, a time of paradoxes. The empire reached its greatest extent on the map, while its real power eroded like a cliff under an unrelenting tide. It was an era of economic anxieties, of rising nationalisms, and of profound uncertainty about the future. Attempts were made to repair the old house with worn tools, while the tremor announcing an even greater earthquake was ignored. And while the imperial lion, old and weary, licked its economic wounds and learned to negotiate with those it had once simply commanded, in the heart of Europe, metal began to be forged anew. Swords were sharpened and war machines were built under dark banners, and the expectant silence that had followed the first great conflagration would soon be torn apart by an even more terrible roar. The tense silence that had settled over Europe during the interwar years was not that of peace, but rather that of a tide receding before the tsunami. It was a held breath, a winter of the soul that promised an even deeper cold. The British Empire, vast on maps but fragile in spirit, exhausted by the memory of the Great War and corroded by the economic crisis, stood like an ancient oak whose roots no longer clung to the earth with the same strength. And then the wind rose again, when the roar of German tanks shattered the stillness of Poland in 1939. The echo of those detonations reached the farthest corners of the globe. Once again, the call was sent across the oceans, from the plains of Punjab and the hills of Kenya, from the Caribbean islands and the ports of Australia. Millions of men donned the khaki uniform. They left behind the scent of monsoon-soaked earth, the dry heat of the Sahel, the silence of the sugarcane fields, to go fight for a freedom that for many of them was an abstraction, a distant promise they did not know in their own villages. In London, as the sirens tore through the night air and the sky turned the incandescent red of fires, Winston Churchill lent his granite voice to the resistance. His challenge was that of a besieged island, but his power to sustain that struggle did not reside solely in the spirit of his people, but in the vast resources, both human and material, of his empire. Indian soldiers were dying in the dust of El Alamein. South African pilots soared through the skies of Italy, and the battalions of West Africa carved their way through the suffocating jungle of Burma. The empire was bleeding for Great Britain, but it was in the Far East where the cornerstone of imperial prestige was shattered. Singapore, the impregnable fortress, the Gibraltar of Asia, the symbol of British might that guarded the trade routes. In February of 1942, in the face of the unstoppable advance of Japanese troops, the fortress fell. The image of nearly 100,000 soldiers of the Empire, British, Australian and Indian, marching into captivity was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological collapse. The myth of European invincibility, that invisible pillar upon which the entire colonial edifice rested, crumbled in the mud and humidity of a tropical island. Throughout Asia, the subjugated peoples watched and understood. Their masters were not gods. They could be defeated. This revelation stoked fires that were already burning silently. In India, Gandhi's call for civil disobedience with the Quit India movement resonated with a new and desperate force. The contradiction was unsustainable. How could Great Britain demand that India fight for the freedom of the world while denying its own? The logic of the empire was devouring itself. The war was not only a moral cataclysm, but also an economic one. Victorious in 1945, Great Britain was bankrupt. It had liquidated its investments abroad and accumulated astronomical debt, not only with the United States, but also with its own colonies, such as India, which were now its creditors. The master had become the debtor. Power no longer resided in the cannons of its battleships, but in the accounting books of Washington and in the will of the peoples who were no longer willing to wait. When the last echo of the fighting faded, a new sound began to be heard, quieter, but infinitely more powerful. It was the murmur of millions of voices who, having paid the price of war in blood and labor, now demanded their reward. The soldiers returned home not as loyal subjects, but as men who had seen the world, who had fought alongside Europeans and had seen them bleed just like themselves. They returned with a new awareness, a question on their lips that could no longer be ignored. The roar of war had awakened the empire from its long slumber, and upon waking, it discovered that its hands were empty. The most precious jewel of its crown, India, no longer reflected the light of London. It was beginning to burn with its own light. The war had left behind a heavy silence, the echo of distant bombs now resonating in the empty corridors of power in London. The effort had been titanic, the victory Pyrrhic, and the empire, that vast construction of stone and will, felt the chill of a winter it could no longer deny. The cracks, once as fine as a hair, had widened in the structure, and nowhere was the tension more palpable than in India, the jewel of the crown, which now weighed like an anchor on a sinking ship. The promise of autonomy, whispered in the dark years of the war, to secure the loyalty and blood of its sons, was now a clamour that thundered from Delhi to Calcutta, a promissory note that had come due. The stage was occupied by giants, men whose shadows loomed over the fate of 400 million souls. There stood Mohandas Gandhi, a figure as fragile as a reed, whose strength lay not in steel, but in the unyielding truth of his satyagraha. His dream was a united India, a tapestry woven with the threads of Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, and 1,000 other creeds, free not only from the British yoke, but from internal hatred. Beside him was Jawaharlal Nehru, the heir, a man educated in the logic of the West, but with his heart anchored in his land, dreaming of a modern, secular and socialist nation. And before them was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a lawyer of glacial elegance, whose conviction in the impossibility of coexistence had hardened over the years to become inflexible. Once a defender of unity, he was now the architect of a separate nation, a refuge for Muslims who, in his view, would become a perpetual minority. His demand for Pakistan, the land of the pure, had shifted from being an idea to an existential necessity. Amid this triangle of irreconcilable wills was sent the last viceroy, Lord Mountbatten. A man of action, charismatic and hurried, with the mandate to dismantle 2 centuries of history in a matter of months. The negotiations in the palaces of New Delhi were a drama of exhaustion and despair. The air, thick with the heat of the Indian summer, was laden with the weight of unspoken words and ancestral fears. The idea of a united India was fading like the morning mist over the Ganges. The logic of the bureaucrat prevailed over the soul of the land. Mountbatten, fearing a prolonged civil war, made the fateful decision to accelerate the departure. The date of independence was moved up by nearly a year. The partition was inevitable. What followed was not a political transition, but a human cataclysm. A line drawn with ink on a map by a British lawyer who had never set foot in India became a steel slash across the land and hearts. Punjab and Bengal were split in 2. Overnight, neighbours became strangers, strangers became enemies. The largest migration in human history began, an exodus of panic and desperation. Muslims fleeing west and east, Hindus and Sikhs fleeing in the opposite direction. The sound of overloaded trains became the lament of a subcontinent. The dust of the roads mingled with the ashes of burned villages. The silence of the wheat fields was broken by screams that history has yet to silence. At midnight on the 15th of August 1947, while the world slept, India awoke to life and freedom, in Nehru's words. The Union Jack was lowered, and 2 new flags were raised. But the joy of birth was inseparable from the pain of amputation. The empire had lost its most prized possession, not in a glorious battle, but in a feverish retreat, leaving behind a legacy of administrative unity and a wound of division that would bleed for generations. The jewel of the crown had been torn away, and in the void it left, the old imperial lion could feel the emptiness of its own end. The sun had finally begun to set, and that same wind, which had been born on the plains of the Ganges, would begin to blow with a new fury across the savannas and jungles of Africa. The crown jewel had been lost, and with it, the cornerstone upon which the entire imperial edifice seemed to rest. The departure from India was not merely a territorial amputation. It was a wound in the soul of the empire, the proof that the era of masters and subjects was coming to an end. And now, the gaze of London, weary and filled with doubts, turned towards Africa. From the offices of Whitehall, where the smoke of cigars mingled with the scent of old paper and obsolete maps, a tremor was felt, the murmur of a continent awakening. The African sun, a sun that no longer seemed to illuminate the empire's banners with the same glory, warmed a fertile land for new ideas. The Second World War had drained Britain, not only in its finances, but in its moral authority. The African soldiers who had fought for freedom in Europe were returning home, questioning their own. The echo of their footsteps on the red dirt roads was the rhythm of a new song, one that spoke of self-determination. The first chord of that song sounded on the Gold Coast. There, a man named Kwame Nkrumah, educated in America and London, became the voice of a people. He was not a warrior with spear and shield, but with words and a vision. His gaze was fixed on a horizon that no longer belonged to London. In 1957, the Union Jack was lowered for the last time in Accra, and in its place, the flag of a new nation was raised, Ghana. There was no great battle, no rivers of blood. It was a transfer of power that seemed almost civilized, a silent admission that the tide had changed. The event resonated across the continent like the tolling of a bell in the fog, announcing that the impossible was now inevitable. 3 years later, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, an Edwardian patrician who seemed a man from another time witnessing the thaw of his world, embarked on a journey through Africa. In Cape Town, before a South African parliament clinging to the old certainties of racial control, he uttered words that would become the epitaph of an era. He spoke of a wind of change blowing across the continent. It was a public confession, spoken not with joy, but with the sober gravity of one who accepts the inevitable course of history, acknowledging that the power once projected with gunboats could no longer be sustained. But this wind did not always blow gently. In Kenya, the land was harsher, the memory deeper. The Mau Mau rebellion in the 1950s was not a political negotiation, but a brutal war fought in the forests and farms. It was an eruption of desperation from the Kikuyu people against the control of white settlers. The smell of gunpowder and fear permeated the air. British soldiers, many of them young conscripts who could barely locate Kenya on a map, found themselves fighting in a war of shadows against an invisible enemy. The detention camps, the barbed wire, the torture were the last and terrible convulsions of imperial power. From that ash would rise the figure of Jomo Kenyatta, a man who went from being a prisoner of the empire to the father of his nation. And so, one by one, the dominions shed their ties. Nigeria, Tanganyika, Uganda, Zambia. Each new flag that was raised was another nail in the coffin of the empire. But these new nations were born with a poisoned lineage. Their borders did not follow the course of ancient rivers or the lines of ancestral peoples. They were scars drawn with ink and arrogance in a Berlin hall decades earlier. Rival tribes found themselves locked in the same house, while others were divided by an imaginary line. Forging a nation from these fragments would be the exhausting and often bloody work of generations to come. The dull sound of one flag after another being lowered became the soundtrack of the decade. It was the sound of ebbing, of the imperial tide retreating to leave on the shore young, fragile nations filled with hope and burdened with the weight of a past they had not chosen. The empire was gone, but its echo, like the heat that lingers in stone long after the sun has set, would remain. And in that empty space, in that absence, a new question would arise. Could the ties of power be replaced by the ties of friendship?
I have a small favor to ask. Many travel through these stories, but few decide to stay. If these tales help you rest or uncover the past, please consider subscribing. It is a free gesture for you, but it is the only way we keep the flame of history alive. My promise is to keep bringing you the greatest mysteries every single week. Thank you for being part of the world's memory.
The tide of the empire was receding, leaving behind a coastline of newly born nations, blinking under a sun that was no longer exclusively British. The roar of war and the clamour for independence had faded, giving way to an expectant silence, the kind of stillness that follows the fall of a century-old oak in an ancient forest. In London, in the corridors of Whitehall, where the maps of the world had been coloured red with unshakable confidence, a winter air was now blowing. Power, like warmth, was dissipating. The empire had died. The question that hung in the air, dense as the fog over the Thames, was what would rise from its ashes. It could not be a return. The lineage of domination had been broken, but it could not be an absolute oblivion either. Too many threads connected the metropolis with its former possessions: a shared language, mirrored legal systems, armies trained in the image and likeness of the British, and a trade network that, although weakened, still pulsed with life. It was in this twilight, in this ambiguous space between the end and the beginning, that an idea as bold as it was melancholic was forged. The Commonwealth. The Commonwealth of Nations, a brotherhood that sought to transform the hierarchy of stone into an association of wills. The crucial test came soon, with the dry wind of India. In 1949, Jawaharlal Nehru, a man who had known the cold of imperial cells, faced a crossroads. India would become a republic, forever repudiating the sovereignty of the crown. According to the old rules, this meant exclusion. However, in the silent conference rooms of London, a pact of extraordinary subtlety was woven. It was a pact forged not with the sound of iron, but with the careful choice of words. India would accept the British monarch, not as its sovereign, but as a symbol of the free association of its members, and as such, head of the Commonwealth. It was a moment of profound poetic resonance. The crown, that symbol of absolute power that had cast its shadow over continents, was transmuting. It ceased to be a yoke and became a brooch, a voluntary meeting point. For British statesmen, beset by the doubt of a diminished future, it was a way to preserve influence, to keep a family united, even if under a new name. For leaders like Nehru, it was an act of sovereign pragmatism, a window to the world, a support network, a forum where their new voice could resonate without the stain of submission. Thus, the Commonwealth grew. As the flags of the Union Jack were lowered in Africa and the Caribbean, one after another, the new nations chose to join this singular club. It was not a reborn empire. It lacked a central government, a common army, a unified foreign policy. It was rather an echo, a continuous conversation among peoples who shared a painful and complex past. They gathered to talk about trade, education, and sport. The sound of cricket bats on the grass fields of Barbados or Calcutta became a language as comprehensible as parliamentary English. But this new tapestry was not without tensions. For many, the Commonwealth was an elegant ghost of the empire, a structure that perpetuated economic and cultural dependencies. It was an attempt by London to manage its own decline gracefully, maintaining the benefits of connection without the cost of occupation. The lives of ordinary people changed slowly. The official in Lagos continued to be governed by a British code. The judge in Kingston cited English precedents. The legacy was a tangible presence, like the moss that grows over the stones of an ancient fortress, softening its contours, but always reminding of its original purpose. The Commonwealth became a testament to the ambiguity of history. It was neither a total failure nor a resounding success. It was and remains a space where the ghosts of the empire walk alongside the hopes of a post-colonial future. And as its leaders gathered in conferences and banquets, reaffirming bonds of friendship, the lines drawn in ink on the maps of the previous century began to ooze. Those borders, drawn with the arrogance of an imperial geographer, had not taken into account ancient lineages, tribes, or enmities. And on the ground, far from kind words and toasts, those lines of ink would soon be rewritten with blood. And so, the Commonwealth of Nations attempted to weave with the threads of diplomacy and goodwill a tapestry that would cover the scars of the past. A pale winter sun over the domains that once knew the fervour of imperial midday. But while in London, statutes were signed and toasts were made to a shared future, in the newly liberated lands, the air smelled of gunpowder and turned earth. The withdrawal of power is not a clean act. It is like tearing out an old and deep root. The land remains wounded, and what was hidden beneath it emerges into a violent and unknown light. The map of the world, which for generations seemed carved in stone, had become liquid. And the new borders, often drawn with the ruler and pencil of an official in Whitehall who had never felt the dust of those plains, became bleeding seams. The most atrocious example, the cry that still resonates in the corridor of time, was the partition of India. The Radcliffe Line, a scar hastily drawn across the body of a millennia-old subcontinent, divided not only lands but souls, families, and memories. The trains crossing back and forth did not always carry living passengers. Sometimes they arrived in a sepulchral silence, laden with the mute evidence of the fury that had been unleashed. Millions of people, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, became refugees in their own homeland, walking paths covered by the dust of their ancestors and the ashes of their homes. It was not the freedom dreamed of by Gandhi. It was a baptism of fire and blood. In Africa, the echo was different but equally tragic. The nations were forced mosaics, collections of peoples and lineages that the empire had united for administrative convenience, not for affinity. Nigeria, the giant of Africa, a promise of stability and wealth, bled in the Biafran War. The Igbo, feeling marginalized and massacred, attempted to forge their own nation. The world watched, through the first television images, showing the famine, the faces of children with immense eyes and skeletal bodies. It was the consequence of borders that ignored the heartbeat of history. The promise of independence had become, for many, a struggle for mere survival against their own neighbors. And then there were those places where the white colonist refused to disappear, where the ghost of the empire clung to the land with the tenacity of moss to stone. In Rhodesia, a white minority, led by Ian Smith, declared unilateral independence, not to free themselves from London, but to preserve a racial order that time had already condemned. That was not decolonization, but an act of defiance that unleashed a long and bitter war, a struggle in the savannah and in the villages that would only end with the birth of Zimbabwe, a nation forged in guerrilla and resistance. From the hills of Cyprus, where Greeks and Turks clashed after the British departure, to the Mandate of Palestine, whose conclusion left a poisoned legacy of broken promises and a conflict that burns to this day, the pattern repeated itself. The empire, in its twilight, did not fade away quietly. It shattered, and its fragments, sharp and dangerous, lay scattered across the ground of the world. Postcolonial conflicts were not simply new wars. They were the continuation of old tensions, sometimes dormant, sometimes stoked by the imperial administration itself, which now exploded in the absence of the iron hand that had contained them. Peace is not the absence of a foreign power. Sometimes it is the fruit of a much older and more delicate balance. A balance that, once broken, takes generations to restore if it is ever achieved. And while these distant wars burned, their echoes, carried in the voices of refugees and in the pages of newspapers, began to reach the shores of Britain itself. The tide of the empire, in retreat, returned to the beaches of the metropolis, the fragments of the worlds it had shattered, forcing its people to finally look at the true face of their legacy. Sound of gentle wind, the distant tolling of a church bell. The thunder of the cannons has quieted. The dust of forced marches has settled on the lands of distant continents, and the ink of independence treaties, once wet and urgent, is now a dry stroke on the parchment of time. But an empire does not die as a man dies. It does not have a last breath, nor a solemn funeral. Its end resembles more a long winter twilight, a light that slowly withdraws from the world, leaving behind a persistent cold and elongated shadows that stretch over the future. Here, in the islands that were the heart of it all, the empire is no longer a map on a school wall, coloured in a defiant red. It is a spectre, a whisper in the halls of Westminster, an invisible weight on the crown. It lives in the language of politics, in the silent assumptions that shape the decisions of a kingdom still struggling to find its place in a world it no longer governs. Its echo is heard in the debate over Brexit, in that almost mystical faith in the nation's ability to navigate alone through the turbulent waters of the globe, an echo of old pride, of the solitary confidence that once propelled the ships of the East India Company into the unknown. The idea of a global Britain is not a modern invention. It is the lineage of an imperial dream, the nostalgia for a time when London was the fulcrum of the world. The empire also breathes in the very blood of the nation. The streets of London, Birmingham, and Bristol are not the same as those that saw the first colonists depart. They are a mosaic of faces and accents that arrived following the routes that the empire itself charted. Men and women from the Caribbean, from India, from Africa, who came to rebuild a homeland that often called them mother, only to find the cold bewilderment of a home that did not always recognize them as children. The Windrush generation, invited to work under the promise of citizenship, and decades later faced with doubt and deportation, is the most visible wound of this contradiction. They are the living reminder that the empire was not something that happened far away, but a force that returned with the tide, transforming the very heart of the metropolis. And then there are the stones, the silent and solemn stones. In the heart of London, museums stand as vast mausoleums of past glory. The British Museum, with its halls filled with treasures from conquered worlds, is not just a collection of art, it is an archive of power. Each frieze of the Parthenon, each bronze from Benin, tells two stories, that of its creation and that of its capture. They are objects laden with the weight of history, and their presence here, under the grey light of an English sky, raises questions that the nation has yet to fully answer. They are the material evidence of a debt that remains unpaid. In the city squares, statues of generals, administrators, and slave traders gaze with bronze eyes at a world they no longer understand. For generations, they were part of the landscape, as ignored as trees or lampposts. But time has worn away their patina of heroism, and now they are seen in a new light. The fall of a monument like that of Edward Colston in Bristol was not a mere act of vandalism. It was an attempt by a generation to settle accounts with the stone ghosts of their city, to tear away the moss of selective memory and expose the truth that lay beneath. Thus, the imperial past is not a closed chapter. It is a latent fever in the political and social body of Britain. It is the source of a confusing pride and a barely articulated shame. It is the awkward silence at a family dinner, the grandeur of a state ceremony, the bitterness on the face of an elder who feels that his country has been taken from him. It is a story too large to be contained in books, too complex to be reduced to guilt or glory. The tide of the empire has receded, yes, but it has left the beach strewn with relics, broken promises, and uncomfortable questions. And now, under an uncertain sky, the nation walks among them, trying to decide which treasures to keep, which debris to clear away, and how to tell the story of what once was, in order to finally understand what it is now. The next step is not to remember, but how to remember, and to whom that memory belongs. The tide of the empire as it receded did not leave a clean beach. It left the wreckage of a shipwreck, street names carved in stone, train stations with Victorian architecture under a tropical sun, and a heavy silence in the history books, a silence that for decades was mistaken for peace. After the storm of decolonization and the conflicts that followed, a strange calm arrived, the stillness of a battlefield at dawn. And in that stillness, the voices of the ghosts began to be heard more clearly than ever. This chapter is not about armies or treaties signed with ink on parchment. It is about something more intangible and perhaps more enduring: memory. Memory which is not an orderly archive, but a living landscape, full of fog and echoes, where the past never completely dies. In the squares of London, Bristol, and Glasgow, the bronze and marble statues, silent sentinels of a past glory, began to feel the weight of new gazes. They were no longer just monuments to triumph, but also to oppression. They were the stone face of a debate that the British nation had long postponed. The moment arrived, not as a parliamentary decision, but as a visceral act, almost telluric. In Bristol, the cold bronze of Edward Colston, a slave trader whose philanthropy had whitewashed his legacy for centuries, was toppled. Not by an army, but by the push of anonymous hands, descendants of a pain that refused to be forgotten. Its fall into the waters of the harbour was a late and powerful echo of the millions of souls thrown into the Atlantic. It was not an act of vandalism. It was an act of memory, a desperate attempt to correct the narrative written in metal and granite. This awakening was not limited to the streets. It penetrated the solemn and silent halls of museums, institutions that were, in themselves, monuments to the empire, cabinets of curiosities filled with wonders brought from the farthest corners of the world. But now, the question floated in the air-conditioned galleries: were they treasures or were they spoils? In the display cases of the British Museum, the marbles of the Parthenon and the bronzes of Benin, masterpieces of distant civilizations, seemed to whisper stories of a plundered kingdom. The captive light of the Koh-i-Noor diamond, set in the crown of royalty, became a symbol not of power, but of a dispute that spans generations. The debate over restitution is not about objects. It is about the return of a fragment of a people's soul. In the political realm, gestures of reconciliation were more cautious, more measured. The words of modern statesmen, when looking back, rarely reach the weight of a full apology. There was talk of deep regret for the slave trade, of lamenting the massacres and famines. Each syllable was heavy, laden with legal implications and a national pride reluctant to admit the magnitude of the wound. For many in the former colonies, these words sounded hollow, like the wind blowing through a ruin. For others, they were a first step, a crack in the wall of silence. Reconciliation is not a destination, but a rocky path that is travelled unevenly. It is the dialogue, sometimes tense, between the grandson of a colonial administrator and the granddaughter of a freedom fighter. It is the Truth Commission in Kenya, unearthing the horrors of the Mau Mau uprising. It is the effort in Australia and Canada to acknowledge the cultural genocide inflicted on Indigenous peoples. It is a painful process, because it demands that a nation look in the mirror and recognize not only the light of its civilization, but also the deep darkness of its actions. Thus, the empire, already dissolved on the map, continued to exist as a wound in the collective memory, a wound that could not simply close and be forgotten. It demanded to be cleaned, examined, understood. And upon these ruins, upon these disputed memories, an attempt is made to uphold a different structure, a brotherhood of nations born from imperial ash. But can a family of equals be built upon the lineage of a master and his servants? That is the question that hovers over the future, a question that time, and only time, will be able to answer. The sun has finally set. The long shadow of the empire has receded, like a tide revealing sands and rocks that have always been there, with their own shapes and textures. And in that twilight, in that uncertain light that follows the day, remains a strange form, an echo, a ghost of the structure that was the Commonwealth. This is our final chapter, not a chronicle of what was, but a whisper about what could be. It is not an empire. There are no canons or decrees to uphold it. It is rather a conversation, a murmur of 56 voices gathering in halls where once echoed the orders of viceroys and governors. It is a mosaic of faces from the islands of the Pacific, bathed in white and salty light, to the vast plains of Africa and the misty valleys of Canada. They share a language, yes, English, that tongue which arrived on warships and merchant vessels, but which is now spoken with 1,000 accents, telling stories that the empire never wanted to hear. They also share legal systems, remnants of a common administration, like old stone roads covered in moss that still mark a route, even though the destination has changed. The actors in this final drama are not kings with crowns of gold, nor generals with maps spread out on an oak table. They are prime ministers and presidents, men and women whose grandparents perhaps worked on sugar plantations or built railroads under an unrelenting sun. They sit at the same table as the British monarch, but the balance of power is a courteous fiction. The crown is no longer the center of the universe, but a distant, almost symbolic sun, whose warmth is barely felt. The true drama lies in their doubts. The leader of a Caribbean nation wonders if his people can continue to pledge allegiance to a foreign lineage, however ceremonial it may be. An African president weighs the benefits of trade and cooperation against the open wound of memory. The action is no longer the clash of steel, nor the advance of the red coats. It is the slow, sometimes painful debate about identity. We see nations, with a silent dignity, release the last thread that binds them to the crown. Barbados, Jamaica. In their deliberation, these are not acts of angry rebellion, but the serene gesture of one who, upon reaching adulthood, decides to walk on their own. The action is the conversation about reparations, a word that resonates like a crack in stone, the attempt to assign a price to centuries of pain. It is a difficult conversation, often stalled, because how does one pay a debt written in the souls of peoples? And the consequence of all this is uncertainty. The Commonwealth finds itself at an existential crossroads. For some, it is an anachronism, a club of ghosts that refuses to fade away, useful only for sporting events every 4 years and academic scholarships. For others, it is a unique network in a fractured world, a space where a small island nation has the same voice, at least in theory, as powers like India or Canada. A forum to discuss climate change, that tide threatening to swallow many of its members, or to defend democracy in an era of rising authoritarianism. Perhaps its purpose is not to build a new power, but to be the guardian of a shared memory, however painful it may be. A forum where the children and grandchildren of the colonized and the colonizers can look each other in the eye, not with the anger of an open wound, but with the melancholic wisdom of one who understands that the past never truly dies. And so, we close this long journey. The history of the British Empire does not end with a flag lowered or a treaty signed. It ends in the silence of these questions. The echo of the empire resonates in the names of the streets of Lagos, in the train system of Mumbai, in the cricket played in Barbados. The Commonwealth is the echo-made institution, a family united not by blood, but by history. Its future is a blank book. Perhaps it will fade like the mist at dawn, becoming a footnote. Or perhaps, just perhaps, In this noisy and divided world, the value of a quiet conversation between old adversaries turned partners will be the most unexpected and enduring legacy of all. It is the silence that follows a long tale, when the fire has burned down and only the embers remain, drawing maps of lost worlds in the ash.